My name is Alara Vance. I arrived at my sister's wedding exactly 11 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin, early enough to be polite, late enough to limit exposure. I walked in alone. A hush fell over the cluster of guests near the gift table, a brief, gossamer silence that I felt more than heard. It was the sound of a held breath, the pause people take right before they pretend they weren't just talking about you. Then came the murmur, carried on the scent of lilies and sea salt. That must be the older sister. Didn't she come alone? And a soft, dismissive chuckle, not surprising. Their glances slid off me like water. I was long past the point of being wounded by them. In the carefully curated album of my family's life, I was the faded photograph, the name people forgot, the chair no one thought to reserve. I was the necessary box to tick, not the person they genuinely wanted in the room. What they didn't notice, what they couldn't possibly know, was the elderly man seated near the front. He had been speaking quietly with a group near the floral arch, his posture elegant even in rest. But when I entered, he stopped mid-sentence. His head turned, and his gaze found me across the expanse of polished floorboards. He squinted, just for a moment, the way one might when trying to place a familiar melody or a half-remembered line of poetry. Then, his expression smoothed into a mask of unreadable calm. I found my seat near the back, a single chair at a table set for 8, and settled in without fanfare. But I had seen him watching me, and that, I knew, was a quiet note that would, in its own time, change the music of the day. I had left home the week after my university graduation and never truly returned. My parents had offered congratulations that felt rehearsed, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. The word proud was there, but it was hollow, an echo in a room where the real sentiment had long since departed. My sister, Chloe, younger by 4 years, had stood beside them, swimming in an oversized university sweatshirt, her own smile a beat behind the rest. I held no resentment for her then. She was still a girl, and the chasm between us was only a crack in the earth, not yet the canyon it would become. Mine was not a dramatic departure. There were no slammed doors, no tearful accusations. I simply left. I had a scholarship for a postgraduate program, a one-way train ticket, and the quiet, bone-deep understanding that if I didn't carve out a space for myself in the world, I would suffocate in the one they had designated for me. While Chloe flourished in the familiar sunlight of our coastal hometown, Port Blossom, I drifted. City to city, project to project, I moved through the world like a ghost. I didn't post my life on social media. I didn't fly home for holidays that felt like obligations. In the beginning, I had held a small, foolish hope that they might reach out, that my mother might call to ask about the view from my window, that my father might wonder what I was reading. They never did. And somewhere between another birthday marked only by a generic group text and another New Year's Eve spent on a plane, I stopped waiting. Professionally, I found a peculiar kind of success, the kind that thrives in silence and is bound by non-disclosure agreements. I became a narrative architect for heritage brands. When a company with a long, storied past found itself adrift, its identity blurred and its profits in freefall, they would be given my name. I was the quiet expert who came in not to slash and burn, but to listen. I'd spend weeks in their archives, reading old letters, studying early product designs, and interviewing third-generation employees. I didn't just fix their balance sheets. I found the original story they had forgotten how to tell and helped them tell it again. It was work that suited my nature. There is a profound safety in being invisible. It allows you to walk through rooms without the burden of expectation, to be underestimated with an ease that can become its own form of power. I had never used that power on my family. For a long time, I hadn't seen the point. I learned of Chloe's engagement through a message in the family group chat. No personal note, just a link to a polished wedding website with a pastel color scheme and photos of her and her fiancé laughing on a windswept beach. Both their families were listed in effusive detail. Under the bridal party, my name was an afterthought, Alara Vance, Sister of the Bride. It felt less like an honor and more like a label on a specimen. I replied to the group with 2 words, "How lovely." I didn't ask for details. I didn't send a gushing text. I waited. The formal invitation arrived 2 weeks late, the corner of the expensive cardstock creased. Inside, under a section titled, "Our Cherished Guests," I found I had been assigned a seat at a table far from the head table, with no mention of a +1. There wasn't even an RSVP card to return, just a QR code with the coolly efficient phrase, "Kindly respond online to help us streamline our planning." It wasn't a wound, it was a diagnosis of a condition I already knew I had. They had made it abundantly clear that I was not a part of the performance, merely a piece of the set dressing, useful only if I remained in my designated spot and stayed quiet. And yet, I accepted. I accepted because the groom's grandfather was a man whose name I knew well, Arthur Sterling. And he was one of the few people who had ever looked at the intricate, delicate work I did and understood its true value. 5 years prior, he had sat across from me in a dusty boardroom, the future of his family's legacy, Oakleaf Goods, hanging in the balance. When I had finished my presentation, he hadn't looked at the projections or the new marketing copy. He had looked at me. And from the brief, assessing glance he'd given me when I walked in today, I knew he hadn't forgotten. The rehearsal dinner came and went, a ghost event in my life. I saw the photos on Chloe's social media feed, a long, beautifully set table under a canopy of fairy lights, faces glowing with laughter, wine glasses raised in meticulously staged toasts. I zoomed in on one photo and could just make out the elegant, calligraphed name cards. I knew mine was not among them. I hadn't truly expected an invitation, but its absence was a statement written in invisible ink. A celebration of union, a gathering of the closest and most beloved, and my own sister had deliberately, methodically, left me out. You don't forget your only sister. You only erase her. The night before the wedding, I sat in my quiet room at a small, elegant hotel overlooking the harbor. Rain traced silver lines down the window pane, and the distant foghorn moaned its lonely song. I could have left. I could have packed my small overnight bag, started my car, and driven the 4 hours back to the life I had built for myself. No one would have called to ask where I was. My absence would have been a small, uncommented upon ripple. But I stayed. I stayed not because I needed their approval, but because I needed to show myself that I no longer did. On the morning of the wedding, I chose my dress with care. Not black, that would have felt like mourning or a statement of defiance. I chose a dress the color of a deep forest moss, a simple silk sheath with long sleeves, and a modest neckline. It was a color that did not shout, it whispered. It spoke of deep roots and quiet growth. I twisted my hair into a low, elegant knot at the nape of my neck. No jewelry, save for a pair of small, simple pearl earrings. My presence would be my only adornment. When I arrived at the Tidewater Inn, the valet hesitated, his gaze flicking to the empty passenger seat. "Just me," I said, offering a small, calm smile. He blinked, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, before nodding and taking my keys. The venue was beautiful, a historic manor perched on a bluff overlooking the churning sea. It was all aged wood, polished brass, and the scent of salt and roses. The reception hall was already half full. A few heads turned in my direction, their curiosity piqued not by recognition, but by the lack of it. I did not carry the easy, bubbly joy of the other guests. I wore my solitude like a well-tailored coat. Across the room, Chloe was a vision in white lace and tulle. She was laughing at something her new father-in-law said, her gown shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. It was a designer dress, beautiful and dramatic, with 1,000 tiny, intricate details that seemed to obscure the woman within. She glanced my way once, her eyes meeting mine for a fleeting second, before she turned back to her conversation, a small, tight smile on her lips. It was a dismissal as clear as if she had turned her back on me. There was no one to greet me, no usher to guide me to my seat. I found the seating chart on a small table near the entrance to the kitchen. My name, of course, was misspelled Alira Vance. And my table, number 14, was nestled in a dimly lit alcove, far from the warmth and light of the head table. I made my way to the empty chair. It wasn't just empty in that moment. In the grand scheme of my family, it had always been. I sat down, crossed my ankles, and gazed towards the front of the room. Arthur Sterling stood near the floral arch, speaking with his eldest grandson. He looked smaller than I remembered, his frame more delicate, but his eyes, even from a distance, held the same steady, intelligent light. He hadn't noticed me yet, but I knew he would. The table they had assigned me was an island of social misfits. We were the distant cousins, the old business associates of the bride's father, the loose threads in the otherwise perfect tapestry of the guest list. I sat for several long minutes in silence, the gentle clinking of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation washing over me. Eventually, a trio of guests joined me, 2 women in identical shades of dusty rose and a man with a sunburned forehead who looked profoundly bored before he had even taken his seat. They offered no introductions. One of the women glanced at my misspelled place card, her lips pursing slightly, before she leaned in to whisper something to her companion. That was the extent of our initial communion. It was only after the heirloom tomato salads were cleared that the perfunctory small talk began, as thin and brittle as a wafer. "So, you're Chloe's sister?" the man asked, his tone lazy as he prodded a stray crouton with his fork. "I am," I said, my voice even and calm, offering nothing more. He blinked, taken aback by the lack of conversational bait. "Traveled far to be here?" "Just far enough," I replied with a faint smile. His own lips twitched into a smirk, clearly unaccustomed to such dry brevity. One of the women, the one who had whispered, decided to take a different tack. Her smile was bright and predatory. "And what is it you do, dear?" I let the deer hang in the air for a moment, tasting its condescending flavor. It was not a term of endearment, it was a tool of diminishment. "I'm a narrative architect," I said softly. "I work with heritage companies to help them rediscover their foundational stories." Her brows lifted, a perfect arch of unimpressed dismissal. "Oh, so marketing then?" "Something like that," I conceded, knowing the nuance would be lost on her. "Sounds a bit abstract," the man grunted, taking a large gulp of his wine. One of those New Age job titles people invent to sound important. I didn't defend myself. Silence, I have learned, is not a vacuum. It is a presence. It is not surrender. It is strategy. My refusal to fill the space with anxious explanations made them uncomfortable, and they rushed to fill it themselves with a barrage of questions they didn't truly want answered. Where I lived, some big city, I assume. They all run off to the city, whether I was married, still flying solo, dear. Time is ticking, if I'd come alone. The unspoken judgment undergirding each query was the same. If I did not have the traditional markers of success, a husband, a house in a good neighborhood, a life that mirrored their own, then what value did I truly have? I let their words wash over me, a familiar, distant tide. I was not there for them. My gaze drifted across the ballroom, to the head table where Chloe was now listening, rapt to a toast from her new husband. She was radiant, playing her part to perfection. She hadn't glanced in my direction once. She wouldn't. But then, the woman beside me leaned forward, her voice pitched just loud enough to be an intimate confidence and a public pronouncement all at once. "It's a shame, really," she said, her eyes flicking towards me with faux sympathy. "You'd think her own family would want to have her closer. Unless, of course, there's a reason." A brief, sharp silence fell over our table, the kind that follows a remark that is both pointed and cruel. Then came the soft, tittering laughter, a sound like glass shattering. It was in that moment, in that small, ugly sound, that something within me shifted. It was not anger, but a profound, weary clarity. I looked across the room again, not at Chloe, but towards the man she was about to call family. From his seat beside the groom, Arthur Sterling was watching me. His gaze was no longer casual or fleeting. He was studying me, his brow furrowed in concentration, his lips pressed into a thin, contemplative line. He saw the woman's cruel smile. He saw the condescending tilt of the man's head. He saw me, sitting in their midst, a study in quiet composure. And then, with a grace that defied his age, he rose. There was no announcement, no clinking of a glass. Just the quiet, deliberate motion of an old man getting to his feet in the middle of a wedding banquet. He picked up his handsome, silver-topped cane and began to walk. Not towards the dance floor, not towards the bar, but with a slow, unwavering purpose, directly towards table 14. Conversations around him faltered and died. Heads turned. A wave of confused silence radiated out from his path. The trio at my table stared, their smirks frozen on their faces. The woman who had made the comment whispered, her voice suddenly tight with apprehension, "Is that Mr. Sterling?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. I simply watched as the entire social geometry of the room warped and shifted around this one man's quiet procession. He stopped just beside my chair. The air was thick with unspoken questions. The guests at my table looked between us, their faces a comical mixture of fear and confusion, bracing for a public reprimand. But Arthur Sterling did not look at them. He did not acknowledge their existence. His full, undivided attention was on me. And then he did something no one in that room could have possibly anticipated. He bowed. It was not the stiff, perfunctory nod of an old man greeting a young woman. It was a gesture of deep, profound respect. He lowered his head, his shoulders dipping in a slow, intentional inclination. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried through the sudden, absolute silence of the hall with perfect clarity. "Miss Vance," he said, the name sounding like an honorific, a title of great esteem. "I had no idea you were here today. If I had known, I would have insisted your seat be beside mine." Dead silence. A collective, room-wide intake of breath. The woman beside me made a small, strangled sound, like a gasp being swallowed. The man with the sunburned forehead fumbled with his wine glass, his face now a darker shade of red. Slowly, feeling as if I were moving through water, I rose to my feet. I was not sure of the protocol, but I was unwilling to let him stand while I sat. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice a low, steady murmur. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "How could I possibly forget?" he replied, straightening up, his eyes twinkling with a light I recognized. It was the light of shared understanding. "You were the one who taught us how to listen to our own story again." He gestured vaguely towards the head table, though his eyes remained on me. "You all know about the trouble Oakleaf Goods was in a few years back," he said, his voice carrying easily, a storyteller spinning a yarn. "The one the so-called experts said was a terminal decline. The one that nearly cost us a century of my family's history." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then his gaze swept the room before landing, once again, on me. "This young woman," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable conviction, "is the one who saved it." I could feel the tidal shift of 100 pairs of eyes. They were no longer seeing the lonely older sister, the woman in the simple dress with the misspelled name card. They were not assessing my marital status or my proximity to the head table. They were staring at a woman they had dismissed, marginalized, and pitted, and realizing, all at once, that the story they had told themselves about me was wrong. From the head table, Chloe had half risen from her chair, her mouth slightly agape, her perfectly applied makeup doing nothing to hide the shock on her face. Her new husband was whispering something in her ear, but she didn't seem to hear him. Her gaze was locked on Arthur, and then, with a dawning bewilderment, on me. Arthur Sterling stepped closer and offered me his arm. "Forgive our oversight, my dear," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, meant only for me. "We owe you far more than a seat in the shadows." And just like that, I took his arm. I walked with him past the silent, gawking tables, past my sister's frozen expression, past my parents, who looked utterly bewildered, their polite smiles having vanished completely. He led me through the heart of the celebration, to the front of the room, to the head table itself. He gestured to the empty chair beside his own, a seat that had been reserved, I later learned, for a revered family elder who had been too ill to attend. A seat of honor. A seat of legacy. As I sat down, my simple moss-green dress a stark contrast to the glittering gowns around me, I caught the eye of the woman from table 14. The one who had said, "Unless, of course, there's a reason," with a smile designed to wound. Her smile was gone now, replaced by an expression of pale, horrified disbelief. Mine was not. I did not smile in triumph. I did not need to. In that grand ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and cascading roses, a quiet truth had finally been spoken. And it was more resonant, more powerful, and more deafening than any applause. The applause, when it came, was scattered and uncertain. A polite, hesitant patter of hands that quickly faded as guests turned to each other, whispering, trying to recalibrate their understanding of the scene that had just unfolded. I did not need their validation. For the next half hour, I sat beside Arthur Sterling, a small island of calm in a sea of social disruption. We spoke in low tones, not about what had just happened, but about things that mattered to us, the enduring appeal of craftsmanship, the subtle shift in consumer values towards authenticity, and how his grandson, the new CEO of Oakleaf Goods, had a brilliant mind for logistics but still struggled to trust his creative instincts. Arthur chuckled at that, a dry, rattling sound. "It runs in the blood," he confided. His grandmother, God rest her soul, used to say the very same thing about me. Chloe did not approach. Not during the main course, not during the champagne toasts. I would catch her eye across the long table, and she would quickly look away, her smile a tight, brittle thing, a mask she had worn in family photographs for as long as I could remember. It was a smile designed to conceal, not to express. But I knew she would come to me. The reckoning was not over, it had merely been postponed. It happened during the dessert course, as waiters circulated with delicate plates of lemon tart and chocolate lava cake. I had just declined a second cup of coffee when I felt a light, hesitant tap on my shoulder. I turned. "Can we talk?" Chloe asked. Her voice was a strained whisper, barely audible above the string quartet. I simply nodded and followed her out of the grand ballroom, through a set of French doors, and into a small, secluded side garden. The sea air was cool and sharp, a welcome antidote to the stuffy, overheated atmosphere inside. String lights were woven through the branches of an old, gnarled oak tree, casting a gentle, dappled glow on the gravel path. Chloe's long, immaculate train snagged on a loose stone as she turned to face me. "You're working with his company?" she demanded, forgoing any preamble. The question was sharp, an accusation. "Since when?" I clasped my hands loosely in front of me, a posture of quiet neutrality. "It was 5 years ago, Chloe. I consulted for them. I didn't work with them. I helped them through a difficult transition. It was quiet. That's how my work is." Chloe stared at me, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "And you didn't think to mention that? To me?" "To Mom and Dad." A long, quiet moment stretched between us, filled only by the distant crash of waves against the shore. "You never asked," I said softly. The words, though gentle, landed like a slap. She let out a short, frustrated laugh that held no humor. "You're unbelievable, Ilara." "Truly." "I came when you invited me," I said, my voice remaining level. I sat where I was told to sit. I didn't make a scene. I didn't say a word to interrupt your wedding. "But you let him do that," she insisted, her voice rising. "You let him stand up and make that announcement. You let him pull you up to the front like some kind of hero." "I didn't let him do anything," I corrected her gently. "He saw something. He recognized me. And he chose to speak. That is all that happened." Chloe turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as if warding off a chill, though the night was mild. I just don't understand you. You've been gone for more than a decade. No calls, no real visits. You just vanished. Then you show up here at my wedding and suddenly you're someone. The raw insecurity in her voice was so palpable it was almost a physical presence in the garden. I tilted my head, studying the sister I barely knew. Chloe, I said, my voice softening with a sorrow I hadn't expected to feel. I never stopped being someone. You and Mom and Dad, you just stopped looking. That stung. I saw it in the way her shoulders tightened, in the way her mouth opened and then closed again, searching for a retort that wouldn't come. What did you want from me? I asked, the question genuine. Did you want me to apologize? For not being the kind of successful that comes with headlines and loud announcements? For not demanding a space at a table that was never really set for me? She didn't answer, just stared out at the dark sea. In the distance, we could hear a swell of laughter from the reception hall, the clinking of glasses. The celebration was continuing on without its bride. Do you honestly believe I didn't care? She finally said, her voice thick. That I just erased you? You didn't erase me, I replied, choosing my words with the same care I would for a delicate negotiation. You erased the version of me that didn't fit the story your family wanted to tell. The quiet one, the one who was more interested in books than in boys. The one who left. It was easier to put me in a box labeled difficult or distant than to make the effort to understand the person I was actually becoming. Chloe's eyes glistened in the soft light of the lanterns. They were not quite tears of remorse, not quite tears of shame, but something lost in the murky territory in between. I was never competing with you, Chloe, I said, the words coming from a deep, quiet place inside me. My life, my work, it was never about outshining you. I never felt the need to. She looked away, her profile a study in conflict. It feels like you did, she whispered. I gave a single, slow nod of understanding. Perhaps, next time, I said, my voice gentle but firm, you should seat your sister as if you know what she's capable of. Not just for her sake, but for yours. And with that, I turned and walked back towards the light and the music of the party. There was no grand exit, no final, cutting remark. Just the quiet crunch of my heels on the gravel, each step steady and sure. I walked away from the sister who saw my success as a threat and back towards a room full of strangers who now saw me with a respect I had earned long before I ever set foot in that hall. I knew who I was. And now, finally, so did they. I didn't stay for the cake cutting or the bouquet toss. The purpose of my attendance had been fulfilled, not in the public recognition, but in the private clarity it had forced upon my sister and, more importantly, upon myself. As the band struck up a loud, cheerful dance number, I slipped out of the ballroom. I moved through the dwindling crowd in the foyer, a ghost in a moss-green dress, no longer invisible, but serene in my departure. I didn't leave entirely unnoticed. Near the grand oak doors of the inn, Arthur Sterling was waiting, leaning lightly on his cane. He looked tired, the long day having taken its toll, but his eyes were bright. You remind me of my late wife, Eleanor, he said quietly as I approached. She never had the loudest voice in the room. But when she spoke, everyone leaned in to listen. The world shifted, just a little, to meet her. I felt a warmth spread through my chest. That's a beautiful legacy to leave, I said. He offered a small, sad smile. You are well on your way to leaving your own. He patted my arm gently. Don't be a stranger to us, Miss Vance. True talent should be kept in good company. Outside, the night air was clean and cold. The valet, a young man with kind eyes, saw me and jogged off to retrieve my car. As I stood on the curb, breathing in the scent of pine and salt, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift from my shoulders. It was the weight of a narrative I had not written, but had been forced to live under for years. Excuse me? Miss Vance. I turned. A young man in a staff uniform, barely out of university, was standing a few feet away, looking at me with a mixture of awe and nervousness. I wanted to say, I read your case study. The Oakleaf Goods restructure. We studied it in my final year business ethics seminar at Georgetown. They called it The Anchor and the Sail. I never knew who was behind it. The author was just listed as EV. Until tonight. I offered him a genuine smile, the first truly unfettered smile of the day. And now you do. He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Most of the people in that room still don't really get it. They just know you're important because he said so. My car pulled up to the curb then, its headlights cutting through the darkness. They don't have to get it, I replied softly, turning to him one last time. My work was never for them. And I didn't come here tonight for them either. I came because presence is sometimes more powerful than protest. Because sometimes the most profound victory isn't about correcting the story others tell about you, but about continuing to live your own, truer one. They had tried to make me forgettable. They had laughed when I walked in alone. And in the end, they watched me leave with my name not just restored, but redefined, my worth not bestowed, but acknowledged, and my quiet departure ringing with more significance than all their loud celebrations. I had not set out to win anything, but as I drove away from Port Blossom, the sea a dark, shimmering expanse to my left, I knew I had reclaimed something far more valuable: myself.